Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show. I'm Kenny Rice. We're glad that you're with us. Thanks for tuning in on the many outlets that we have, from YouTube to iPad to Google Play, and this is episode number 19. We talked about getting as good as it gets guests. We have one of them right now. He is a master wordsmith, senior writer for Sports Illustrated, and here's what makes a great writer, in my opinion. This line: this is the story of two horses, one ridden by a jockey and the other riderless. That perfectly sums up the Preakness, and now we bring in Tim Layden. Tim, welcome into the show.
Hey, thanks, Kenny. Great to talk with you.
And I did love that, because that was the Preakness, wasn't it? We had Mark Cassey on last week, and half-jokingly he said, John Velasquez stole my thunder. More people have talked about Bodie Express running around the track than the fact that War of Will won.
It's crazy, and I sat there for 15 minutes looking at a blank screen in the press box saying, how do I get my arms around these two stories, which, it was funny. I thought, well, I'm not going to make too much of a big deal of this loose horse. And then I started looking at social media, and people were texting me, and all anybody wanted to talk about was the loose horse. So I thought I better make this a dual lead here. Because I think people were really fascinated by that.
I imagine that some of your friends that you cover so many sports, Olympic sports, NFL, et cetera, like some of my friends in the boxing world or in the basketball world, they legitimately were asking me, what if that horse had finished first? Would he have been declared the winner? So I spent probably like an hour of my life explaining to them that he would not have been declared the winner, but people would have talked about it as much as they are now.
I know. In fact, we're like 10 days since the Preakness, and we had a guest in our house last night, and the first thing he said to me was, I got to ask you, can a horse run around like that and win the race? And I've had to explain it like 20 times, and the thing that seems to confuse people that aren't in the horse world at all is they said, well, that poor horse had to ride all the way around alone, and he might have won. And I said, well, he also had to ride all the way around without 126 pounds on his back. So, I mean, there's and I don't want to make light of what could have been a really bad situation, but that's the most basic thing. The rules say you got to have a jockey on your back. And, if you and I want to go have a race, and, I get to run just in my shorts and T-shirt, and you got to carry, roughly, 10 or 12% of your body weight on your back. Let's try that and see who wins, and it was a very interesting situation. And it's one of those moments, Kenny, that when you cover racing, you always have to keep in mind the extent to which your audience knows exactly what they're seeing. The hardcore racing audience understands all this, but all of us that are even close to the sport know that you got to expand in any sport. You want to expand the readership, the viewership, and to reach those people that had never seen anything like this, you kind of had to write about it and or talk about it, or show images of it. Whatever your platform is, and it was a really, really, a very unique circumstance.
Tim, I don't know if we're going to have another Triple Crown season. Who knows what's going to happen next week at the Belmont? But given the Derby and given the Preakness, I've never seen anything like this. And given what happened, the tragedies at Santa Anita, I don't know if there's ever been, and probably there should never be, another year for horse racing like we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, it's been really wild, and it's been wild in a way that you really have to be careful how you present it and talk about it to people.
Right.
And the Santa Anita thing, and now I saw that there's been calls coming out today to ban racing across the country until they reach zero deaths, which I think most people in the game realize is not achievable. But it is the absolute correct goal. But you had all those issues at Santa Anita, which were framed in very different ways, and not everybody understood that there may have been things going on that weren't necessarily being addressed or being talked about. I mean, the track condition and the weather versus whips and drugs, and not saying that everything can't be a part of the equation, but it was, I think, very confusing to people. And then we got to the Derby, and people immediately said, well, this is another black eye on racing. And my view of the Derby was, it was a painful night for everybody because those 22 minutes took 22 years to go by to get that DQ up, and I don't think the stewards handled themselves in the best way possible, and they may have gotten advice not to. That will all come out in the wash eventually. But at the same time, the Derby was a sporting event where an official's call was made that upset a lot of people. But that happens every day in sports, and people get angry about calls. But I think more people at the end of that felt that the officials, however they handled it, got the call right. And I understand that a lot of people don't think that because it was the favorite or near favorite that came down, so there was a lot of money on his back. But I didn't view the Derby as a black eye. I viewed it as a challenging night for everybody, or evening for everybody. But it was just a referee's decision that affected a sporting event, and that's the way I looked at it. And the Preakness, it was a really good horse race, and War of Will proved himself to be a terrific racehorse. Doesn't mean he would have won the Derby. And the loose horse, in the end, again, Johnny Velasquez didn't get badly injured. The horse did not get injured. The outrider didn't have an easy time of it, but eventually she caught the horse and no bystanders got hurt. And so again, it was unusual, but I don't think bad. But we in the media, and you and I are part of it.
Yeah.
We can be guilty of trying to wrap our arms around everything and giving it all one theme, and things are usually more complicated than that. I think the racing season has been more complicated than that.
We were talking with Tim Layden of Sports Illustrated, also a contributor to NBC and their horse racing coverage, and wrote a brilliant essay about hold all tickets, was the punctuation at the end, which is why they say hold all tickets, talking about the Derby. And you equated so many things that happened, and one of them that I can relate to as a kid watching the 72 Olympics when the U.S. should never lose, but they lost to the Soviet Union. And I have a friend, Kenny Davis, who played on that team, who I think has in his will that will go on, decades after he's long gone, that no heir will ever collect that silver medal. So that went through my mind, and I think that's one of the great things, and that's what you do so well, and what Rob Hyland, who was a guest last week, our producer, does, and the rest of us try to, is relate other sports, because horse racing as itself is not the sport that everybody follows anymore, like they did in the 40s and 50s. And I do think analogies play a big part in that. And you did that brilliantly, I thought, with your essay showing other sports that have happened that have had controversial endings.
Yeah, and I'll give credit to Jack Felling there, who was another guy Kenny, who's a feature producer at NBC, and he reached out to me right after the Derby and said, do you think there's something to do in an essay that talks about people who thought they had something won and then they didn't win? And we even got into like the Oscar thing with Moonlight and La La Land and, and the Miss Universe thing. And there's a lot of ways that this can go. It really is a big part of sports where, either while the game's still going on, you think, we got this thing won. It's a basketball game. We're up 10 with a minute to go, and, a football game, and we're on the 1 yard line, going to wrap it up, and stuff happens. And in horse racing, the thing I kept coming back to was, in all of us who have ever watched a horse race or made a bet on a horse race, we know that, there's that minute when they cross the finish line, and then you wait for that official light to go up on the board. Even if it looks like nothing could possibly have happened, sometimes something happened. And, that's why, I got hold all tickets, is that line that if you had the winner and you hear hold all tickets, your heart just sinks. And but if you had somebody else in the race, particularly the runner up or the third place horse, and you hear hold all tickets, it's like renewed life, and I do think it happens in every sport, maybe not in quite the same way, but it's not over even when it's over sometimes. And the Derby was that kind of race, and the fact that it was the first time in 145 years was just kind of disruptive to everybody.
Tim, I thought about that because my favorite movie in racing of all time, and we had Michelle Phillips on, who played Mrs. Davis in that movie several weeks back, is Let It Ride. And I always think, because I got friends like that are looking on the ground for that winning ticket that's been accidentally either dropped or discarded because they didn't hold all tickets.
Yeah, and I think there was a story in Louisville. Somebody wrote that there were like a lot of tickets picked up on Country House.
Yeah.
On the grounds at Churchill. That there's a lot of people there that day, and I don't know if it's an urban legend at this point that people found uncashed tickets on that horse, but I could certainly see why you would have tossed your ticket. And then it's hard to get out of Churchill Downs. You head toward the exits, try and get an Uber or a cab or whatever, and and you just throw that ticket away, and someone maybe looks around for it afterward.
And I got a buddy that sent me a picture, so I know he made the bet. It was like $300 to win on maximum security. He asked me, with the litigation, everything going on, is there ever a chance he'll cash it? I said no. Maybe no. eBay. You might get some eBay money back. I don't know. Maybe it'll be a collector's item, but don't hold on to that ticket for any other reason.
No, people have. I'm sure that there's litigation somewhere where people have managed to make something out of a losing ticket. But there's a lot of people with tickets and I think there's already class action suits and things like that. But it's not going to happen once that official sign goes up. It's heck, Kenny, one of the first big racing stories I ever wrote 30 years ago was about a horse that got DQ'd at Saratoga. And what happened was the stewards saw the wrong number on the saddle cloth. And someone yelled, well, it was the 8 or maybe it was the 9. I can't remember the number. And they all got it in their head that that's the horse they were taking down. And they took down a horse that was the winner. And he was a good price, and he was live that day, and a lot of people were on him at like, I don't know, 5 or 6 to 1 or something, or 8 to 1, and the stewards took him down even though he had nothing to do with an incident in the race, and it became a real thing. And I wrote a big piece on it a year later, and all 3 stewards lost their jobs and really struggled to try and regain their footing afterward, and there were a lot of lawsuits filed, and but none of them successfully, and that was a case where the stewards admitted the next day that we got it wrong, and but by then, as you could tell your friend, it's too late.
Yeah.
Once that official goes up, it really, there's no way, the system is not set up to get all those tickets back and make all those people whole that had that horse. So it's I don't know. Maybe someday there'll be a different way of doing it in racing. But right now, if that official goes up, it doesn't matter what happens afterward.
How did young Tim Layden, get involved in horse racing to become the writer that he is today, covering it for SI?
I was, I grew up in upstate New York, about an hour from Saratoga, but never went. I played football, basketball, ran track, and loved all the mainstream sports. Really didn't have any interest in, I wasn't like a kid who grew up in Louisville or Lexington or somewhere like that, and didn't have horses in my family. And but my first summer internship was at the Schenectady Gazette. I was a junior in college, and the Schenectady Gazette covered Saratoga for, back then it was 4 weeks, 24 days.
Right.
And one day the guy who covered Saratoga said, I'm away this weekend. Do you want to go up and cover the Alabama? And I said, yeah, sure. It's a major league event. So I went up there in the morning and interviewed a couple people on the backside just for the exercise of doing it, and covered the race. And I can't say I was immediately smitten. The thing that I liked about it was that it was a big time sport where I had, been doing little league baseball tournaments. And so it was a chance to get around an event where there were 30,000 people there, and a lot of money on the line, and the top people in the sport were there. And then, the next summer I covered a few more days. And when I went full time, I was in that Albany area for 10 years and just spent a lot of days at Saratoga. And it's never been the primary thing that I covered. I think that, for me, unless you work for a racing publication, it's hard to be only involved in horse racing. It's not big enough. And so I cover racing a few months a year, and sometimes only a few weeks a year. And I really enjoy it as a change of pace from mainstream sports. I like the authenticity of it, the fact that you're dealing with people who've had life experience. It's there's some fascinating young people that play basketball and football, but in a lot of ways their experiences are very, very homogeneous. They were great athletes. They got a scholarship. They got drafted. Now they're in the NFL or the NBA. Now they may have some life history that's a little different, but you get jockeys and trainers and owners that have really got some wear on the tires, and they have great stories to tell. and it's fun to tell those stories. And even beyond that, sometimes you get a whole lot of drama like we've had this spring. So it's again, it's not something that I've ever done 12 months a year, but when I'm involved with it, I find it really fascinating. And I said to somebody else that interviewed me about this once that they said, well, why do you pick these horse racing stories? And I said, look, a story is a story. Especially in the modern media where there's so much digital content and, you want people to find what you're writing. It better be good. It better be interesting. It better be different. And, racing has a lot of stories that fit that. And the best racing stories I've found and written get widely shared and read and because people just like stories, and racing has stories. So, I just sometimes they're not great or positive, but that's true of any sport, and anything you cover is going to have negative and positive. But racing just has good stories, and that's why I like it.
In the Belmont, I'll see you there. Wow, this could be interesting. What could happen next, Tim? This is a what can happen next moment going into the Belmont, isn't it? And we know War of Will's going to be there. Who knows how it's going to play out? But I think the things that have happened without the Triple Crown on the line immediately, as we knew not long after the Derby that Country House wasn't going on, it certainly kept it more interesting than, honestly, I thought it ever would. I didn't know what we were going to keep doing, the rest of the way to come up with story ideas. But given the way it's playing out, I think it'll be an interesting Belmont for just some of the reasons, wacky or otherwise, that have happened along the way this time.
Yeah, I think War of Will has a chance to. I mean, look, to be realistic about this, the Triple Crown is a great entertainment product, for NBC, for all the publications that cover it, for Churchill, for Pimlico sometimes, and for Belmont sometimes. And but there's a flaw built into the system, and we all know what it is, which is, number one, if the Derby winner doesn't go to the Preakness like this year, the Preakness is diminished by that. It becomes a different kind of event, which there are plenty of ways to cover. And it turns out this year it was a fabulous story to cover, but there's no guarantee that the Derby winner going on 23 straight years after Grindstone is kind of a shock.
Yeah,
really,
it is.
That no horses have ever come up sick or sore coming back in 2 weeks after the Derby with a rodeo that race is. It's really remarkable the Derby winner has come back so consistently. But then you get the Derby, the Triple Crown situation where if the Derby winner does win the Preakness and doesn't win the Preakness, and then you got a Belmont that's not for a Triple Crown, then that tests everybody's resolve in figuring out what the stories are. But you can't recreate a Triple Crown scenario. You just can't. There's nothing to match that, and I don't think we're going to return to a time when the Belmont alone is a big enough race to attract 100,000 people to Belmont or a huge TV number. It's just everybody's expectations change, and then it can still be a really good race and a really good story. I mean, one year we had Rags to Riches in Curlin. Another year we had a Fleet Alex. There's been some really good Belmonts that didn't involve a Triple Crown, and I think War of Will is a tremendous racehorse, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if he can kind of be this year's the Fleet Alex, where, that was 14 years ago, which is getting on up there. But when that horse won, the way he came back to his feet in the Preakness and won, and then 3 weeks later he wins the Belmont convincingly, I think everybody walked out of there saying, well, there was no Triple Crown, but we sure as heck know who the best 3-year-old in the country is. And maybe it'll be a race like that for War of Will, or maybe it'll just be a great race between 2 or 3 or 4 other horses. And I hope people watch and enjoy. But it's not the same as a Triple Crown, and everybody knows that, and it's not something you can run from.
Blood, Sweat, and Chalk, Ultimate Football Playbook, How the Great Coaches Built Today's Game. If you haven't read it, it's available on Amazon still. And one Tim Layden wrote it. And I always like football. I still like football. I love the obit, the tribute to Bart Starr, who I had a chance to meet a couple of times and have that chance to sit down and interview him once years and years ago. And, he's one of those guys, you meet that legend. And I remember as a kid watching the Ice Bowl and all that. And it was really, I was touched, not just by your article, but by everything that's happened this week with some of the losses of, Bill Buckner and these guys that you watch growing up or when you're a young guy. And, a little piece of you's gone with them, I always feel. You're losing a little more of your youth when guys like this pass.
Yeah, it's been a tough week. And I think that for guys in our general age range, sort of baby boomers or whatever, all the guys that we grew up watching, who in some cases only a few years older than us. Buckner was only 69 years old, and Bart was 85. That's a little older, but he was a hero to a lot of us, and or someone we watched with great rapture. And we're getting to an age where a lot of these guys we're going to lose them. And I agree with you that it does evoke your youth, and it evokes the youth you've lost, and that's just the way life is. And I think sports, the way it moves us when these guys are alive, it moves us when they die as well. And I think you mentioned Blood, Sweat, and Chalk, which is a book I wrote a few years ago about the great innovators of football history and how they, it's not really an X's and O's book, although there's a heavy element of that. It's more about the people who came up with these, Bill Walsh with his West Coast offense, or Don Coryell with Air Coryell, and, the Texas wishbone and all those things. And gosh, I talked to a lot of guys who conceived these things, and a bunch of them are gone in the 8 years since I wrote the book. So I'm glad I had a chance to talk to those people and to learn a little bit about their inspiration for some of what they put together. And then the way football, I'm sure you have football fans on here, the way football has evolved in the little less than a decade since I wrote that book. I think you could do it. You could do another one. You could do Blood, Sweat, and Chalk too, and have just as many innovations in there in the last decade. And but I'm not going to do that, by the way. But there's been a lot that's happened, and but you're right. This has been a tough week, and it's just part of what you deal with as a human and a sports fan and everything else.
I love the book too because because when you read this, you realize there's not a whole lot of things that are new. There's things that are tweaked and improved on, perhaps. And I liken it back when I was growing up as a kid. We used to go watch the Kentucky Colonels of the ABA, which is a lot like watching the NBA now. It was 3-point and slam dunks back in '75 when I was watching George Gervin and Julius Erving and Dan Issel and Artis Gilmore and George McGinnis and guys like that playing. And I kind of see the NBA, which was greatly influenced, I think, by the ABA. And to watch the game now, it's about 3-point shooting and slam dunks. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm having flashbacks 40 years ago when I was a boy.
Yeah, it's the ABA is, it was such a renegade league, with the tricolored ball and the 3-point shot and more of a wide open game. But you're absolutely right, Kenny. I mean, the ABA has greatly influenced the modern NBA. And, I think Louis Dampier would love to be playing in the modern NBA right now,
yeah.
With a 3-point shooting and, Rick Mount. I'm sure that there are a lot of guys that look at the modern NBA and think, boy, this came along 30 or 40 years too late for me, the way they play now. It's really, and you're right, the coaches, so many of the coaches I talk to, I think Joe Gibbs put it best when I was talking to him about the running game that he put together with the Redskins in the 80s that was so successful and won multiple Super Bowls. And he talked about how he borrowed something from Nebraska and something else from somewhere else. And then he said, and what we did here we thought was pretty original, but I'm not going to say that because no doubt some high school coach in Kansas has been doing this for 30 years. And, he said, there's really nothing new. You steal, you try to innovate, but the likelihood that you're totally new to it, that you're really the founder of something in football, really any sport, is pretty unlikely. Probably someone was there before you. And coaches in football and everywhere else, one thing I really learned from the book was that you can call it stealing, you can call it borrowing, you can call it being inspired by, but they are happy to pick and choose from what other people have done well and try to make it their own, and usually to give credit as well. It's it's a really interesting world that way.
Tim, it's been a pleasure. I know you got a plane to catch. I look forward to seeing you next week at Belmont.
All right, Kenny. Thanks. Always a good time.
Hey, thanks for being on. Tim Layden,
Yep.
One of the best writers out there, senior writer for Sports Illustrated. Coming up next, Lafitte Penkai Jr. Stay with us. This is the Horse Racing Show.